Hello, everybody. This is Sensafili sparring partner. Welcome you all. And this is Monica Paolini from Sensafili. And today I have Mark Gilmour with me, and he is the CTO at ConnectiviTree and ConnectiviTree. And what we're going to talk about today is something that kind of goes at the very, very foundation of our industry. And so in previous podcasts, we talk about 5G, 6G, specific items. Today, again, we go even further down and we talk about wireless and wireline. Is the difference between the two still relevant? And sometimes I ask that question because, as you might know, Sensafili means wireless. And I thought when I started a company, created a name, I thought, well, that's obvious name. And I started questioning more and more because any wireless connectivity that we have eventually ends up in wireline fiber. And so when you think about my connectivity, your connectivity, the connectivity of any device out there goes through wireless and then wireline. What changes is at which point you go from wireless to wireline. And for Wi-Fi, it's different than cellular, or if you have an Ethernet connection, which very few people now these days have. So when I thought of having a discussion, the first person that came to mind is Mark, because not only have I known Mark for a long time, but he has been working on both sides of the equation and working with the other half. So working in wireless with wireline people, working wireline people with wireless people. So I'm not going to steal the show. So I'm going to let Mark introduce himself and then tell us, because it's a very interesting story he has to tell us. So Mark, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Great to be with you. Thank you for this invitation to speak on your podcast platform. I'm an avid listener, so it's nice to be on here. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Over my career, I've been the wireline guy in a wireless network or a wireless operator, and I've been the wireless guy or in a wireline operator. And actually, by even mentioning that in that frame, we're already picking up on a particular area that is kind of focused in that. When I talk about being the wireless guy in a wireline network, actually what I'm actually referring to is cellular, and being the guy that knew a little bit more about the cellular network in a wireline company. And then when I was in a wireless company, or actually it was a predominantly cellular operator, then I was the wireline guy in that. But so isn't that interesting how we've kind of grown into these camps within the industry, that wireless means cellular or mobile networks, and wireline is fiber. But actually it's so much broader than that, as regular listeners to this podcast and industry people will know. It is so much more than that. But yeah, I've experienced both. I've been on the vendor and the operator side. I consult on both sides today with my consulting company, Marlis Consulting, and then I've also, I've got a CTO role at a pan-European and global was that long haul telecoms operator. So stepping way away from the access environment, where this wireline wireless conversation happens a lot. So yeah, I've got some interesting perspective over the years, and it's been difficult to try and shake that image that I have in either one of the entities. If people from my days in players like Colt or Sienna will say, "Oh yeah, Mark was the wireless guy in there," and yeah, in my days in the mobile operators like Three and managed services with Ericsson, I was always the fixed guy, the bit the doing the mobile backhaul bit, the guy with the fiber. But then
So, Mark, hold on. When you wake up in the morning, you look at yourself in the mirror. What do you think of yourself? Are you the wireless guy or the wireline guy?
Neither. Neither.
Are
I mean,
you?
no. To these days, today, I try and think of it more in terms of in terms of the connectivity guy. It's connectivity. It's the whole telecoms market. And I know I mean, that's the other thing. Telecoms isn't necessarily seen as sexy, but the telecommunications angle, our aspect of it is fundamental to all of this. The ubiquitous connectivity is what drives all of the other applications and I hate to say it, digitalization that is going on. I mean, that's a long term, a term that's misused a lot in the industry. But all of these things that are going on, it all comes back to you need a base level of connectivity to enable it all to happen. Whether that is done via a wireless access point or via a fixed access point, it's yeah, it's kind of an irrelevance at that point. In my book these days, now I'm looking at the whole picture, and I have been actually throughout my whole career. It's just you
Yeah.
get pigeonholed into one or the other.
No,
And
I know. And, the problem is that now you just, focus on 5G and 6G as if that's kind of like, that's it, in terms of from a sort of high level technology point of view. And, again, I always said, I'm a wireless analyst, a wireless consultant. I never even thought about it. But in the last 5, 6 years, I increasingly felt somewhat not uncomfortable, but I don't think it's really representative of what I do. So it's like as I said, it's connectivity, because what you care is can you do what you want to do from an end user point of view or even machine point of view. If you are a camera, well, if something is a camera, you just want to be connected. How you are connected, it's irrelevant as long as it works. It just turns out that the last step ends to be more and more wireless for all sorts of reasons that we know. But eventually, it can't just go wireless all along. It breaks down.
no,
Not because wireless is bad, it's just not what it's supposed to do.
yeah, I mean, if I look back to some of the early days of the mass rollouts we were doing for mobile networks in particularly in the UK, that would be my reference point. But equally, as I later on in my career, as I was um, uh, traveling across the globe and speaking with international players and regional players. That early days of the cellular build outs, we were doing a lot of the transport, the backhaul for that wireless, that cellular wireless access point. We were doing a lot of that via wireless transmission, microwave transmission and things. And the reason why we were doing that was for ease of deployment, for speed of deployment, because it was not just about the technology itself. It was also all the other things that went around that, the regulatory aspect, the time to build out. It was easier to put microwave links in and get good, decent capacity out to those sites that was needed at the time to be able to bring up coverage, mainly for voice. Then we entered the 3G era and started bringing more data. And then that transition to 4G. That transition to 4G really, I recall very well being looking at all of our cell sites across the UK and going, we need to bring fiber to more and more of these cell sites to be able to accommodate the demands that are coming via the cellular access points, via these devices and that has been the trend. And as I traveled around the globe speaking with operators across the globe, that transition was moving from a backhaul network which was 80% wireless and 20% fixed to ideally the complete opposite, 80% fixed and 20% wireless. And there was I recall the former CEO of AT&T, I think his name Randall Moffat, I think his name was. I'm paraphrasing his quote just then, but talking about that mass densification of cell sites and cellular network, the wireless network. He said, essentially, I'm building a massive fixed network, fiber network with wireless endpoints. And that's exactly what we were doing, is trying to get fiber or fixed access, fixed connectivity as far out to the edge to then have wireless access points off that for all of the connections, because, you know, most of us do not want to be tethered to a cable for our end connectivity. But ultimately, we've been trying to get it to a fixed access point or a wired access point as quick as possible for all sorts of reasons of efficiency, bandwidth, etc., latency, those sort of things.
No, absolutely. And the question is the balance between the two. And I have been a big supporter of fixed wireless access, because in some cases, especially when you go into rural areas, it's excellent. You think about satellite, you know. So there's not a question that everything has to be fixed, but even with satellite, at some point, you get to fiber. I mean, you don't, you know, there's a bunch of wireless steps, but you go to fiber if you want.
Well, and then when you get into the cloud, we think of the cloud as this ubiquitous,
it's fiber,
or thing that's floating in the air somewhere. And the reality is, of course, is that all the cloud is a series of network data centers, and they are connected internally via fixed cabling, and externally via big fat pipes.
you know, submarine cables. I mean, really, again, not the most sexy thing. It's not 6G in terms of like, oh my God, this is so cool. You know, you're gonna allow you know, like the new use cases and all that. You don't have that. With that, it's just like you have solid connectivity. So whatever innovation you may have, it's basically more of, should I say more of the same, or am I kind of?
No, I mean, the innovations that have happened in fixed capability has been massive. You know, the when we talk about 100 gig being essentially the workhorse of backbone networks, and you know, today 10 gig, 25 gig on the backhaul type of interface, you know, that is phenomenal. That the work that has gone on in research development and innovation to that, and now we're dealing in 800 gig as a standard piece. The IP over DWDM discussion that is going on and the convergence that is happening there. You know, 800 gig is the client these days, and now we're stepping into 1.2 1.6 terabits per on individual wavelengths. You know, that's a massive leap forward. So the innovation has been incredible. I remember, you know, when I started in the industry, and you know, 2 meg and I was a late starter. There are others that can come on your podcast and talk about days of kilobits per second, but you know 2 meg big trunk pipes and things like that, amazing. And now we don't even.
But I guess, you know, the thing, I'm not denying the amount of innovation, but you know, when you think about your phone, my phone, it doesn't really make any direct. Actually, 5G doesn't either, arguably, but you know, there is more that we talk about, like, oh, you know, with 5G now we can do this with more capacity.
Although it could be Monica, it could be argued that there are very few examples of with 5G you can do this.
No. Well, okay, there is a lot of talk about that, so there's something that you can think of. Now, with transport, it's actually not true, because the reason why we can do video on a phone is because there is more transport. Otherwise, forget it. Because a lot of the latency, I mean, I looked at the latency, most of the latency, or let's say half of the latency, comes from the rest, not from the interface. I mean, actually, there are three elements. There is a latency introduced by your device to render. there is a latency from the access and then latency from transport. So no matter how low the latency is in the access, you still have the other two parts of latency, and capacity is the same thing. So clearly, our ability to do a lot of video depends on the fact that we have transport. But we do, and I guess it's also in the industry, we don't see it that way. We see
Not
it
in the
as the access allowing us to get to video or whatever the next service is.
Yeah, I mean, where we are today in communications networks is amazing, really, and we the talk now in access networks, and essentially, wireless, whether that's cellular, Wi-Fi, in IoT, whether it's any one of the 3GPP or non-3GPP technologies, wireless pretty much wins out in the end device end connection state, and it makes absolute sense to do that. And depending on the technology, depends upon where then that interface happens then to the wireline the network, or basically the trunk network. Wireline is then used as your trunk network to get you places, to get you to the cloud, to get you to connect the cloud together, or to get back to in this AI driven world now, to get to these AI models, the large LLMs, etc., that are being driven for the training, for the access to those. All of that is kind of on the fix or on the trunk side of the network, but the access play makes a whole heap of sense for it to be wireless, because it just brings that different level of flexibility. I mean, the whole argument for the wireless factory, for example, was this ability to be able to reconfigure factory lines and etc., and all those sort of things, which the appetite has been less. But I think we're starting to see some of those things start to pop out. You can see some of the benefits in that, but it makes a whole heap of sense to have whatever the wireless technology is. I think one of the challenges with the cellular industry is that we try and think that the whole thing revolves around the cellular industry, and that that's the centerpiece from everything else. And actually, it's not. It's one of the cogs in the whole picture. One of the things I learned during kind of the 5G, the 4G, 5G, and into the 6G development phases was actually going out to speak to other industries, I started going to a lot of manufacturing conferences and different areas to try and understand what the demand was coming out. And I very quickly realized is that it was poles apart from the cellular world talking about these use cases. Absolutely poles apart. It comes back to, I think, the point you made at the head of the podcast today, which was, they don't really care as long as it works and as long as it delivers the performance that is needed.
And actually, if you go to verticals like transportation and utilities, which I have more experience, they use all sorts of other bands that a lot of it is legacy. I mean, I'm not, and how you want to deal with it, but there's a lot of other technologies that clearly are not in our collective consciousness. So saying we don't talk about it all the time, because if utility does whatever, I mean, it's like their own world. Why should we? But there is a lot going on. And I think that the cellular infrastructure is absolutely crucial. As I said, yeah. I mean, we're not advocating that the cellular infrastructure should go away or whatever. It's absolutely necessary, but it's only part of the equation.
Yeah.
So not only Wi-Fi takes 80% of the traffic, which I say this all the time, but clearly it doesn't mean that it has 80% importance, because the cellular bits are more important than the Wi-Fi bits, because when you are outside and you need to, get driving directions, you do need, that's more valuable than watching something at home on your screen. The value of each bit is higher. So but at the same time, this kind of assumption, and when you talk about wireless, you talk about cellular. It's just, I think it's just misplaced in the sense that it just shifts the whole thing, you know.
A recent example of that, I'll give you something from, we're both avid users of LinkedIn, and on there quite a lot, as much as we can be. And there's some really interesting discussions going on right now at the moment, because the world of this ever increasing demand for data in the cellular world seems to be, that bubble seems to be somewhat, not necessarily bursting, but that utopian picture seems to be somewhat tainted. There's a realization that data traffic isn't just going to keep driving up exponentially in the cellular network, and we're starting to see a tailing off. There's a forecast of tailing off coming on, potentially even an S curve of demand, or this interesting observation that across the globe, users are kind of topping out at around 30 gig per user, not because of any limits that are being imposed by the network or by the provider, but just because that's what you consume with the services and applications that are used today. And the main culprit for that would be video in its all its various different forms. And so you kind of go, well, that does it lend itself to a world, a view that data is going to taper, or the growth is going to taper in the cellular world. But then the discussion that happens sometimes seems to pick that the telecoms world, or the telecoms capex or telco capex and things is going to plateau because and you're like, oh, hold on a minute, let's frame this correctly. Cellular might. It's the cellular part of the network. Another interesting discussion. I saw somebody come on and claim that telco is dead. Telecoms is dead as an industry.
Oh yeah, there is the doom and gloom.
Yeah. Something, and you kind of picked at that a little bit on that. I couldn't resist. I had to get in and pick at that a little bit when somebody mentioned that. And I went, what do you really mean by that? And when I just peeled back the skin just a little bit, they were talking about enterprise voice,
mm-hmm.
and the idea of telephony,
which obviously,
hold on a minute, that boat set that industry changed massively 20 years ago, and so the framing is really important. And so we can't use, it's important to know that when we're talking about wireless, are we talking about cellular in that? Are we talking about Wi-Fi in that? Are we talking about any of the other myriad of access technologies that exist out there to enable connection? And then and be a little bit more accurate in our representation, so that we can because I can absolutely assure you that on the wireline side at the moment, growth continues in terms of the data usage. It continues to grow, particularly as there's more compute going on, and the idea of these large compute locations being federated or interconnected. Then the machines talking to machines in that, it's standard. It's standard kind of world of machine learning and AI development. Then you can see where there's going to be growth in there. I'm not necessarily a proponent that it's going to be exponential. I've still yet to be convinced by that. But the use of our language in these pieces, wireless doesn't mean cellular, and certainly cellular doesn't mean the whole of the telecoms network or the whole.
And actually, so going back to the wireless versus wireline, if you look at the transport network, might give us a more accurate view of what actually we do with connectivity as a society, because it doesn't pick, again, a single technology. Because what you do on cellular is only whatever you're doing, and you have 24 hours per day, and hopefully you're not spend all of them using your phone. We see now, like attempts at not having kids having cell phones in school. So people try to limit the consumption. I mean, which is not, I mean, it's fine. But why should we expect this thing is going to grow forever where our life, I mean, our daily life is still 24 hours? At some point, it's just going to stop.
Yeah, not without a fundamental shift in terms of how the network is, how the network in total is being used, and when we're talking about consumer or human consumption, enterprise or consumer human consumption, there is a limitation that comes in. It'll be new work streams, I suppose, driven from a machine base where I could see more growth. But then again, and how much of that is going to require mobility, and cellular is obviously king in mobility I think that's the thing. And that part, that's really for me, when we could start a whole new podcast session now if we opened up the 6G can of worms. But for me, the most important thing that has to be solved in this 6G era as it's being developed is the idea of ubiquitous connectivity. That has to be solved and seamless across the board, and not just the idea that wireless wireline convergence means you have one bill.
No, absolutely. And then there is markets like assisted driving and eventually automated driving. That's gonna drive traffic.
I mean,
but to a point. I mean, it's not
on the network. Not on the network. I've never been convinced by this idea that moving to level 5 autonomy means that your cars or your vehicles have got to be 100% connected to the network, because that's never going to happen. It's just not.
Okay, but let's say it happens tomorrow. Okay, I am with you on that. But let's say it does. It would have some increase, but it's not going to change. But it's going to change something, but it's not going to keep the kind of growth rates that we had initially in the industry. Is because you went from nothing to be able to do pretty much everything on the phone. Okay, I'm going to simplify. We're done. I mean, there is an incremental change.
Yes.
But also, there is incremental efficiency. So, when you do video, you can be more efficient with video. So you do more video, but the video takes less bandwidth. So it all kind of balances out at the end, I think.
Yeah, improvements in codecs and things like that. Yeah, make a huge difference in compression ratios, etc. Yeah, absolutely.
So sort of back and forth. So
anyway, the other things that we would do. Well, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but in terms of things such as scheduling and more intelligent use of the network and things like that. The whole automation, and we've spoken on that before. The whole automation and closed loop automation and things like that, all to increase the efficiency within operations. Those sort of things will continue to, which will, like you say, temper the overall growth factor. But
and also increase the amount of capacity that you have on the same network, which means that even if the traffic goes up, doesn't mean that the infrastructure requirements go up in the same way. So anyway, so we have a few minutes. So let's just say, is it still relevant to think about wireless versus wireless? Because sometimes it's like, is it wireless or wireless?
Not versus, no. I think when you're looking in the access domain, it's going to be looking at what are you trying to achieve, and then pick the best connectivity method for that. Mobility, cellular is king, absolutely king. But short range connectivity. For example, home working, office working, Wi-Fi, perfectly fine. Absolutely. But the bigger challenge, I think, is when you start getting to things, fixed wireless access versus fiber to the home. That's an interesting piece, because that becomes an economics piece. And in there, you've got to you then open up a whole different discussion point, because it's not just about the technology that you use, but it's also about the environment surrounding that. You know, one of the biggest challenges is regulation, building out network. I in my my deployment days, some of the biggest challenges, particularly in Europe, are either the UK or the European Union, have been based upon access rights, whether it's for a cell tower and the height of that cell tower, or for digging fiber to that cell tower, or to the network node, or the increase or the location of data centers and power going into those data centers, and the creation of new power generation to cope with the new data centers and things. All of that is equally as part of the discussion. The wireless wireline piece, it's no longer versus. Each has got its area that it makes sense to utilize in.
I'm going to add another one, that is the overhead cables. In Europe, it's not much of a problem. In the US, it is. I have, like, I don't know, 10 cables coming to my home. I start cutting them by hand because it's just more than I need. But it's like really ugly. Do we really need ugliness with all the wireless?
Here's an interesting. There was a whole. We're going to go off into another tangent here, Monica. But
go ahead.
The whole. There's been a trend towards decluttering the streetscape. Yeah, brilliant. But interestingly enough, this is another example of quotas and or metrics driving the wrong behavior. Yeah, because this is me on a bit on my soapbox. So this is this represents the views of Mark, not anyone else or anything else. But it's a little frustrating that because of this metric in the UK of how success is measured in the fiber to the home rollout, that it's based on homes passed, not necessarily homes connected, but homes passed. And so it becomes a race to how many homes can you pass. Now, I live in a little abbey town in Hampshire, in the south of England, and there are a number of notices on the lampposts around my little cul-de-sac area now, and this is in danger of being the not in my backyard sort of the NIMBYism thing. But there's a whole load of notices where they're essentially, it's not even a planning application, it's just a notice that a whole load of telegraph poles are going to go up. Now, there's no telegraph poles in this area at all. It's all underground cabling and ducting into the houses for the copper network. Even for the alternative network that we have in this area, which is DOCSIS on cable TV and cable from the cable company. That's all underground, but it's been approved to put telegraph poles, and so we're going back to overhead cabling to be able to meet the targets to have fiber to the home. Now, I'm very conflicted about it, because the idea of having fiber to the home, great, but
overhead
really is it's a step back. And the reason why it's been doing is because it's cost and efficient and time. It's much quicker, much cheaper to put the telegraph poles in and run it in that way. And so anyway,
Seattle is going to show you the way of how to do that. Okay, on this kind of negative note, we're gonna end. I think we can go a little bit deeper next time around, because this is actually a lot to talk about this, and nobody really seems to be, not nobody, but it's not a prevalent topic of conversation. So thank Mark so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Monica. Good to speak to you. Take
care. Thank you all for listening to the Sparring Partners podcast, and see you next time.